Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg. Jacob, we're recording this on Monday morning. Our readers will hear it tomorrow, Tuesday morning, and a few hours after it first goes live, the Cabinet will meet. So, in the light of what's being written at the moment about the negotiations, Prime Minister, the EU and the Cabinet, what do you think will happen at Cabinet tomorrow morning? Do you think it's likely a deal will be proposed by the Prime Minister to Cabinet, or will something else happen?
It's very difficult to know. That the Sunday Times story is bound to be well sourced, that Tim Shipman is a very serious-minded journalist and he doesn't make these sorts of things up. And that seemed to suggest that the EU and the UK had come very close to an agreement, at least at official level, and the obvious thing to do with that, if that's what's happened, is to present it to the Cabinet. On the other hand, there is a political finesse involved to try and persuade the Cabinet to accept what is proposed, and members of the Cabinet may be very reluctant to agree to an endless membership of the Customs Union and a long but waffly future partnership agreement.
Having set the scene by asking what will happen tomorrow morning, let's step back from the scene, because we could spend a lot of time guessing about what may and may not happen, but actually look at the issues of principle and of policy that are at stake. I mean, in your view, is it acceptable, is it something you could vote for, to have a backstop with no time limit and from which we had no unilateral escape clause? And I mean at this point a backstop applying to Northern Ireland only.
There's no possibility of having a backstop that applies to Northern Ireland only. It must be a United Kingdom agreement. The Northern Irish question is a question about the whole United Kingdom. But let's go back to first principles, because actually this is a matter of trust. The Prime Minister has promised various things, and any deal that she does must match her promises. Now, the most important of these were in the Conservative Party manifesto, because that is the contract between the government and the British voter. What did that promise? Out of the customs union, out of the single market, laws set by the UK, and our money returned and control of our borders. Those are the tests. And we must then look at what the Prime Minister said about implementation period. Remember, when it was first announced, there was a very pedantic desire to use the word implementation rather than transition. This was to implement what had been agreed by the 29th of March, not an extended negotiation period. What we're talking about now is an extended negotiation period that may go on and on and on because they can't conclude it. That does not meet the Prime Minister's previous commitments, and that's what she must be held to account for.
Now, she also signed, and the government agreed last December, this joint report on the Brexit negotiation, which contained these famous paragraphs 49 and 50, 49 of which, according to the EU and the Irish government, commits the government to a backstop that will align Northern Ireland in regulatory terms with the Republic and with the single market. So I'm just going back to that again to double check that surely, if that was in any final agreement, would be unacceptable.
Well,
yes?
Crucially, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, which is in the same document earlier on, and I would assume that that paragraph is the senior paragraph. What was agreed about a year ago was an appearance of a weakening of the Prime Minister's red lines. They looked to get a little bit pink. And there was this term creative ambiguity, which is a deeply unsatisfactory way of handling affairs. To say in the UK it means X, whereas in the European Union it means Y. It's actually typical of our whole experience of the European Union that governments have signed up to things that the EU has said means one thing and they've told the British electorate it means another. And we have usually found out that the EU's interpretation is the correct one. So, I think we must go back to nothing's agreed until everything is agreed, and we'll simply say we are not agreeing to this backstop. We would rather leave without a deal than to sacrifice Northern Ireland to have it ruled by a mix of Dublin and Brussels.
You're not going to vote for that?
No, of course I'm not going to vote for that.
Right, OK.
But nor will the DUP. There won't be a government to push it through if they betray Northern Ireland.
I wanted to start with the backstop because yesterday I tried to ask 5 questions that you'd put to any deal, that would apply to any deal and that would sort what it's really all about. And just on your point of creative ambiguity, we do read, do we not, that about a fortnight to 3 weeks ago, the Attorney General said in an informal meeting of Cabinet Ministers, well, look, if people sitting around this table were advised at Christmas that this backstop proposal doesn't mean anything, I'm telling you as the Attorney General that that's wrong and that the EU's interpretation of it was correct.
And therefore the previous paragraph, the earlier paragraph, saying nothing is agreed till everything is agreed is the crucial paragraph. It's very important to remember the government cannot bind by agreement the law of the United Kingdom. That has to be done through Parliament. And so the Prime Minister says this, the Prime Minister gives her word, the Cabinet agrees it. Unless it comes through a power that already exists, it cannot bind the nation without statutory enforcement. The country's word is not given by the say-so of the Prime Minister. It's given by law.
If the, it's an if, and we all hope it won't happen, and maybe it won't, but if the Prime Minister put a proposal to Cabinet which contained the backstop as understood by the EU and the Irish government, what are the implications for Scotland if Northern Ireland is in the single market and the SNP are able to campaign and say, look, they've got the benefits of single market membership, we should go independent and get the same?
Well, I dispute the word benefits of membership of the single market. I would say burdens. But you're absolutely right that from a unionist point of view, it would really strengthen the SNP, it would strengthen the logic of Nicola Sturgeon's position and would encourage the dismemberment of the union. But it would also show the government not to be unionist. If it says that there can be a different law imposed by the European Union on Northern Ireland, then it's not a unionist government. And we are the Conservative and Unionist Party. It's not just the DUP who would be upset. It is Conservatives up and down the country to whom the union is very important. It's Scottish Unionists, it's English Unionists, Welsh Unionists, and the Unionists in Northern Ireland.
We did read the last time the government performed this section of the dance 2 or 3 weeks ago that David Mundell and Ruth Davidson raised precisely these concerns with Downing Street, did we not?
We did indeed, and they were absolutely right to. And what's so important about that is that they both backed Remain. They're not hardline Eurosceptics, but what is important to them is the nature of our country, and our country is a union.
Just a third point, and we've been through the single market aspect in the question of whether Northern Ireland would or wouldn't be aligned with the EU rather than with Great Britain. We've looked at the Scottish dimension. Now, one thing we read is, don't worry, the government's won, or is on the verge of winning, a major victory here, which is that we'll be able to keep the whole United Kingdom in the customs union. So the difference with Northern Ireland will not apply. What do you think of that?
There was something on Brexit Central, I think, yesterday, from Change Britain, saying that the Prime Minister had said 32 times, I think it was 32 times, I'll stand correction, that we would not be in a customs union. I expect the Prime Minister to stick to her word. Saying the whole UK would be in a customs union for an extended period is an abject failure.
She'll say it's not the customs union, it's a temporary extended customs arrangement.
Well, I hope she won't say that, because that wouldn't be truthful, and the Prime Minister is a truthful lady.
And were she to propose a temporary customs arrangement, as with the backstop, one would need either a time limit or some unilateral exit mechanism, but one not.
Look, the truth is, if there is an extension of the customs union, that is a failure of the government's policy. And the government, when it fails, has to be held to account for that. It would be a failure to deliver on the manifesto. It would be running away from the Prime Minister's many commitments. And governments can't just abjectly fail in their policy without any consequences.
in your view, we have to leave the customs union by the end of transition?
Of course we do. That's what the government promised. Indeed, the fact that we're extending it to the end of transition is not impressive. The transition period is a major concession from those of us who expected to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. Making it a perpetual transition or customs union is simply not really leaving the European Union, because the European Union is founded on a customs union. It's the key thing to remember, that it's developed since then, but its founding principle was a customs union.
Right, now, well, we've done the backstop, Northern Ireland and the single market. We've looked at the Scottish dimension. We've looked at a whole UK customs union, or maybe a customs union for Northern Ireland, plus a separate but adjoined customs union for Great Britain. Let's just turn now to the political declaration. And you mentioned Tim Shipman's story earlier. You'll have seen that it was heavily briefed in that story that when Jacob Rees Mogg and the like read this political declaration, they're going to be delighted because it's so like Canada. What do you feel about that?
Well, I'm very flattered that their aim should be to seek my imprimatur, but I doubt they'll get a nihil obstat from what one further reads, is it will actually set out options of what may happen. And this is the key. The government mistakenly accepted the EU's refusal to negotiate in any detail the future framework of the relationship, even though that's set out in Article 50 itself. And that was one of the early negotiating defeats that the government suffered. And this has left them in the position of potentially paying £39 billion without knowing what they're paying for. Now, look, I'm not interested in paying £39 million for a promise, goodwill, for nothing tangible. That's British taxpayers' money, and a lot of it. And so I think we need more specifics, and we need conditionality on the money. We need some reason why the EU should agree anything. Otherwise, it's just a wish list of happy thinking.
My fifth question was going to be, the fourth is precisely when, if ever, is it worth voting to hand over X billion for a promise rather than something that's bankable? We've just dealt with that. I was going to ask, surely, fifthly, the EU is going to want, I presume, to spare the Prime Minister's blushes and not reject her Chequers proposals openly. Therefore, aren't you bound to have a declaration that's got an element of what Nick Clegg calls checkerda in it, whereby you look at it and parts of it can be read as a Canadian-type free trade deal, parts of it can be read as Chequers. You've just referred to options. I mean, this doesn't look very clear from where we sit now, does it?
No, it doesn't look clear at all. And that is not worth paying £39 billion for. I'm very keen that the Prime Minister should appear to succeed in these negotiations, and indeed should succeed. But I don't think it would be a success to have a waffly document, whether it's 3 pages or 50 pages or 500 pages. We need to be tying down specifics as to what we want, and it needs to be conditional, so that the money is only paid when these things are achieved. Otherwise, we lose all our bargaining power with the EU, and it needs to be completed by the 31st of December 2020, so that it can be implemented in full on the 1st of January 2021, which is what the government's policy has been. All this seems to be providing cover for a failure of government policy, and that is not something that people like me will vote for, because the option of leaving on a clean global Brexit suddenly becomes really attractive. We're out. We don't pay any money at all. We have no legal obligation to pay them anything. We will be free to set our own tariffs, both with the EU and the rest of the world. We will be free to control our own borders. And yes, the government's put out notices about the terrible things that will happen, including, as I'm sure you're very concerned about personally, the fact that imports of caviar may be a little bit more difficult after the 29th of March. Well,
it hadn't yet crossed my radar.
I know that many readers of Conservative Home will be very upset by this, but we'll cope.
Upset by not having it, or upset by the fact it hasn't crossed my desk yet?
Both. They'd have expected a hard-hitting piece on this terrible risk.
It's not the kind of thing I tend to produce very often. All right. I mean, just thinking about what's on the table, I mean, you said essentially, well, we can't live with the EU Irish government version of backstop. You said it's got serious implications for Scotland. You said we should be out of the customs union by the end of transition. You've said that there must be conditionality applied to money in terms of what's in the political agreement. And you've also said that it looks as though it may not be clear whether or not it's a Canadian type document, a document that points towards that solution or not. I just wanted to ask, for what it's worth, we were writing questions about all this on Conservative Home yesterday, airing them publicly and saying, well, whatever the Prime Minister brings forward, these are the key questions. Why isn't the ERG doing that?
What do you mean? Why are we not? What are we not doing?
I didn't see anything yesterday, or more particularly this morning, from the ERG in the papers saying it's not clear what the Prime Minister is going to bring back, but here are the tests we think that she should meet.
Because we don't have a daily outlet for our views. Of course we're in discussions and conversations and trying to find out what is happening. We're inevitably that's a continual process.
You don't have a daily outlet, but you're quite capable of turning the volume up and down in the media when you wish.
I wouldn't say that it's entirely up to us, the volume that comes out.
You're being quite quiet at the moment.
That's because there is uncertainty. And I have always wanted to give the government the benefit of the doubt. I'm a loyal Conservative and have backed the Prime Minister and wish her to do well. There is an awful lot of gossip and rumour about what is happening. If every time there is some story coming out, the ERG says this is an outrage and I jump up and down and so on, though I can't jump very high, it would be a foolish spectacle, it makes the ERG look as if it's overreacting. We have to wait and see what actually comes, having set out what will and won't be acceptable. And basically, what we will accept is what the Prime Minister committed herself to. If the Prime Minister sticks to her manifesto commitments and her speeches before Chequers, that is something the ERG will live with. And now there is a lot of speculation that that won't happen, which is what we've discussed, and we've discussed your 5 questions. But we don't yet know. You said to me at the beginning, what will be presented to the Cabinet on Tuesday? I don't know. It may be that they nail down on the future framework a Canada-style deal and that the money is conditional and that the backstop has gone and that we're all very happy with it. And there's no point in my attacking the government for something that won't happen.
It's not the case that the ERG is kept quiet because its leading members have differences about what to do?
The ERG inevitably has nuances of view, but is remarkably united.
What do you think about the Norway to Canada proposal? I don't think I've had the chance to ask you about this yet. That was conceived by George Yarrow, Rupert Darwell, pursued very energetically by George Trefgarne, pursued in the Commons extremely energetically by Nick Bowles.
I mean, I've chatted both to George and to Nick about it, and look, they're both highly intelligent, thoughtful men who want to get something that can be acceptable to the Conservative Party, can reunite the Conservative Party and would work. And therefore it's always been worth taking seriously what they propose. I think the difficulty has always been how do you get out of Norway and into Canada once you're in Norway? Isn't the EEA designed for people joining the European Union rather than departing? Hasn't the Prime Minister of Norway said that coming into it as a means of leaving is not what it's there for, and that he would therefore be very reluctant to accept this, and that therefore there are real difficulties with it. We also become a rule taker in that period. So, is it in any sense better than the transition period? But mightn't it just last longer because you don't know what the exit will be? The EFTA court almost invariably follows the ECJ. And the only occasion on which Norway refused to implement a directive the government fell and it was implemented by the new government. So you don't have much independence within it, and you have to be in a customs union as well because Norway and Sweden has controls at the border. So it's a partial argument of a solution which has many difficulties surrounding it.
Just going back for a moment to the prospect of no deal, I don't want to pursue that too much this week because we're looking at what's on the table now. But let's suppose the government produces a proposal that's problematic. One of the arguments that will be put for it is, well, you should vote for this rather than the chaos of no deal. Isn't a difficulty that if you postpone the negotiation on the trading relationship, you'd push it forward into the transition period, that you'd actually face precisely the same cliff edge nearer a general election? So there is an argument that could be put to say, if you're going to face this difficulty, better face it now than in 2 years when the negotiations are still carrying on, when the EU's still not brought them to a conclusion, and you end up being in exactly the same place then as you are now, but just nearer a pole.
That is a very wise and astute observation, that if the implementation period is not an implementation period but a negotiating period, then you have the same issue with the cliff edge and you roll it on inevitably if it hasn't finished very shortly before a general election, because there's no time to implement leaving without any arrangement before the election, and it all looks chaotic. But this is where the government is politically in very grave trouble. So a poll out this morning saying that Conservative voters are very committed to leaving the European Union. There have been other polls saying 70% of Conservative voters support Brexit. If the government fails to deliver Brexit, it will alienate its base support of voters. On the other hand, if it isn't ready to deliver a Brexit without any agreement, a clean Brexit, and mucks that up and hasn't prepared for it psychologically as much as physically, then the government's in trouble too. And it really is incumbent upon the government to get its act together. And the negotiations so far have not been impressive.
Is your sense that if the Prime Minister goes to the Cabinet with a proposal that is flawed in the ways we've discussed, is your sense that any Cabinet Ministers at all will resign?
I don't know. I haven't asked any Cabinet Ministers that direct question. There's a lot of speculation in the newspapers. Historically, it is very rarely the Cabinet that stops a policy happening. Bear in mind that Cabinet Ministers are there at the goodwill of the Prime Minister. They're not there because they have independent political bases. It's easier for backbench MPs to come together to stop governments going in the wrong direction than it is for cabinets.
Do you think Cabinet Ministers should see written legal advice on what any proposal means from the Attorney General?
There's a call for that, but ultimately it's a political decision. It's not a legal decision, and people have to decide whether they're delivering Brexit or not. And lawyers are there to give the advice that they're paid to give, and if they don't give the advice that they're paid to give, you get another lawyer. Lawyers are not authoritative in that sense. They give advice. It's only when it gets to a judge that it's determined. And lawyers often say things are arguable. Great lawyerly word, which means there is a case, but probably most judges would throw it out, but sometimes judges don't. So I wouldn't hang my hat entirely on the legal niceties. I'd be much more concerned with the political realities. And that's simple. Are we leaving the European Union, or are we becoming the vassal state?
There's a controversy about what happened over the declaration last December, in which it said that Michael Gove asked for advice on what the backstop meant, not from lawyers and not from the Attorney General. He was given an assurance that in broad terms it didn't really mean very much, and he wrote an article to that effect in the Sunday Telegraph. And that he has come to the view that as he's meant to have said in Cabinet, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me for being fooled twice. Next time, I want an authoritative ruling from the Attorney General on what any text actually means. And that's simply why I'm asking the question, that might it not be better to have, I'm sure the Attorney will give advice orally in Cabinet on what any contentious section of the deal means. Wouldn't it be better to have it in writing to avoid any possible doubt?
I think we're putting too much weight on a legal matter which is fundamentally political. If you go back to last December, it was ultimately a political decision of the Cabinet to accept that. It had the opt-out of nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. It had paragraph 50 that qualified paragraph 49 and gave authority to the Northern Ireland Assembly, that obviously isn't sitting at the moment. Whether the EU's interpretation was right or the UK's interpretation was right, people were talking about creative ambiguity. They knew it was ambiguous, they knew that it was unclear, and that was the politics of it, not the legality of it. And what is the legal force of a document until it's implemented in law by Parliament? Anyway, it's part of a negotiation. And the government was desperate to get onto the second stage and was going to agree to almost anything and pretend that it meant something else. And that was a political choice.
Presumably the Chief Whip, I suppose at political Cabinet, should give advice on whether any proposal can get through Parliament without splitting the Conservative Party. Yes?
I don't know formally what advice the Chief Whip gives. I have a lot of confidence in Julian Smith. I think he is a formidable Chief Whip and very assiduous in making sure that he takes the temperature of the Tory party. And I'm sure he gives that advice because I've always assumed that was the Chief Whip's job. But as I don't sit in political Cabinet, I don't know.
What did you think about Tracy Crouch's resignation?
I thought it was a great loss. I hold Tracy in the highest regard. She's just such a fundamentally decent and good person with a strong moral compass, which is very impressive in politics. And losing her was a loss for the government. And it was a loss for the government on an issue where Tracy is unquestionably right. You know, all of us MPs, and I don't know whether you had this when you were still in Parliament, have constituents come and see us whose lives have been ruined by gambling. And it's a really serious and horrible problem that the fixed odd betting terminals has made worse. And the government can put it right. And once you know that you can put it right, you should put it right straight away. That, as Tracy's pointed out, delay is going to lead to people committing suicide, taking their own lives. That this is absolutely terrible. And I mean, it's the Treasury again. The Treasury is not an organisation I'm at all impressed by, as you know from our previous conversations. So I think it's very sad.
Should Downing Street have spotted the problem? And it's the kind of thing that Whip-like people and commentators tend to run around saying afterwards. There's a wise shaking of heads and, oh, well, Downing Street should have seen that if the Treasury put off the point at which the new rates implemented by 6 months, that they'd be in terrible trouble with Tracy Crouch, who feels very seriously about it.
Well, politicians are quite bad at this in a way, that there's never a deadline for anything. It's always going to happen tomorrow. This issue has been an issue for years. It's already been very significantly delayed. And where Tracy's, I think, so impressive is that she said, no, look, this is a delay too long. It's not as if she hasn't accepted previous delays, because this could have been done. She's been arguing this case for a long time. It could have been done ages ago. It fits in with the Prime Minister's vision for Britain in the speech she gave on the steps of Downing Street when she got elected. Taking care of those who are most vulnerable and least able to look after themselves and need some intervention by the state. I'm not a great one for state intervention, but there is a point at which people's lives are being ruined that it is right for the state to intervene. And the worst possible argument for not intervening is it costs a little bit of money to the Treasury, not of money being spent, but of money that you are taking off some of the poorest in society, whose lives you're ruining. This is taxation foregone rather than expenditure. And the two are very, very different, because the government is actually saying, we're going to take money from people who, in the process of our taking money from them, are ruining their lives. It's very hard to see that that is a moral proposition. It's not like tobacco, where the taxation that brings in money for the state is actually primarily there to discourage people from smoking. And if you took the taxation off, more people would probably smoke. With fixed odds betting terminals, you're just taking a share, you're raking in a bit of what the bookmakers would otherwise get.
What did you think of the budget as a whole?
Oh, I thought it was a workmanlike budget under difficult circumstances. I mean, I would love to see a Nigel Lawson-style reform of taxation and examination of the dynamic effects of tax changes, but I have to be realistic and recognise that with no majority, it would be very hard to get such a budget through.
Did you read an implicit threat in it to Brexiteers that, well, here is a relatively pain-free budget with some modest tax cuts and a lot of money for the NHS and some for defence and quite a bit for potholes. All this will be put at peril, you know, if you don't vote for a Brexit deal.
Well, nobody believes the Treasury, so if that was implicit, it doesn't really matter. They've made such a fool of themselves with their previous threats. The punishment budget we were going to get if we dared to have the temerity to vote against the Treasury's advice for Brexit in the first place, which never materialised. But bear in mind, if we leave without a deal, a clean Brexit, we have £39 billion. So giving more money to defence, and perhaps we could give more money to schools and to potholes. So it's all perfectly possible to sort out, and the Treasury, I'm sorry to say, is a discredited forecaster.
Well, we'll come back to this next time, and I'm sure I'll have the pleasure of quoting all this back at you when one day you're Financial Secretary to the Treasury or some other post within that great institution. But at any rate, let's knuckle down and see what happens this week in relation to Brexit. And Jacob, once again, thank you very much.
It's always a great pleasure. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.